All right, here's African geography. This is actually going to be our introduction to the great empires and kingdoms of Africa. So I thought it would be a good start for us to begin with just the geographic features of Africa as a continent before we actually go into individual kingdoms. So let's get started. Okay, here is a satellite image of Africa, and you can see here it says land of geographic contrast. That's because Africa is a continent, and most people usually think it's a country, but it's actually a continent. So, in fact, it's the second largest continent, the first being Asia. Now, it's 4,600 miles by about 5,000 miles, so it's pretty big. Most people don't realize how big Africa really is. It has 11.7 million square miles in total, and it actually occupies 1/5 of the Earth's land surface, so it is really quite a large part of the planet. Now, here's how big it really is. This is really a great chart because if you look at it, you can see that I can stick the United States, Argentina, India, New Zealand, China, and even all of Europe into Africa. Yeah, so Africa is really quite large. Again, the United States we think of as a big country, but the United States essentially fits in North Africa. So the rest of the continent is quite big. So why is it that most people don't seem to understand this? Because most of the maps that we use in the world today distort the shape of Africa. They're designed to make Africa look smaller and make places like Europe and the United States look bigger. So that's usually done for political reasons. But geographically, Africa is really a large continent. Now, here's some of the diversity that we see. First of all, there are deserts. Now, about 40% of the continent of Africa is covered by desert. That's the classic kind of desert that we think of, sort of sand and gravel and rocks. Now, the largest of those is the Sahara, which is located in the northern part of Africa. And the Sahara Desert, which is the largest desert in the world, is approximately 1,000 by 3,000 miles. Okay, now if I look at this map, what's 1,000 by 3,000 miles? Essentially, it's the United States, minus Alaska and Hawaii. But if you look at that map over on the left, you can see that the Sahara Desert's really quite large. But essentially, the entire continental United States would fit in the Sahara Desert. They have a desert the size of our country. So if you've ever driven across country, let's say from New York to Los Angeles in California, you would be driving the entire time across a desert. That's how big the Sahara Desert is. Okay, now the other desert that's worth knowing is the Kalahari Desert, and that's located in the southern part of Africa. And you can see it here on this map. It's located in several different countries, right? So it's located near South Africa. It's also in part of Namibia and Botswana. And it's a pretty big desert. This desert's very different than what most people think of, though. This desert's not made of sand. There's actually grasslands, there's trees, there's animals. When the monsoons come and bring rain, it's actually sort of wet and lush, but most of the year it's pretty dry. And even people live in the Kalahari Desert. The Klon Bushmen live there, and they're experts at being able to find and locate really sort of difficult to find sources of water. And the Namib Desert on the western side, you can see along the coast, is actually one of the driest places on the planet, which is really interesting considering that it's right along the coast of the Atlantic Ocean, but it's still one of the driest places in the world. Okay, let's check out the Sahel. The Sahel is this area in Africa that actually means coastline. Okay, now that's an Arabic word, so that kind of gives us a hint that there's some Arab influence on this part of Africa. It actually borders the southern edge of the Sahara. So the Sahel is that area where the Sahara Desert ends and the grasslands begin. This picture on the right sort of dramatically shows that. The northern part would be desert, the southern part is grassland, but that area in between is known as the Sahel. Now, on a larger scale across Africa, that's a place where a lot of people actually live. It's a transition, again, to the grasslands and rainforest that separates the desert from those two regions. Now, each year, the desert spreads into the Sahel. Now, that's not because the desert's actually alive. That's because people go into the grasslands and the rainforest and they cut that stuff down. And the more people sort of ruin the soil and the grasslands and they overgraze and they cut down trees, then the easier it is for deserts to spread in those regions. So every year the Sahara is actually getting bigger because of human activity. Now that brings us to the savanna. Savanna is grasslands. Okay, so usually we think of plains or grasslands, or in this picture, which actually shows Kenya, a very typical Mount Kilimanjaro, Kenya picture. When most people think of Africa, this is what they think it looks like. But savannas don't occupy all of Africa, just certain parts. Now, 40% of the continent is actually covered by savanna. And the largest number of people in Africa actually live in savanna. So if I look over here on this map, I can see that this reflects the population density of Africa. So the brighter the orange and red, the more people live in those regions. And as we'll see, that's actually the regions where savanna grasslands are located. The other area that we should take a look at is rainforests. Okay, obviously what rainforests have are densely wooded regions with a lot of rainfall, hot, humid, and again, enormous amounts of rain come down, particularly during monsoon seasons. Now, these areas of rainforest cover what we call Central Africa, but it only covers about 5% of the continent. And you can see on this map on the right, those sort of greenish areas going right across the central part are where Africa's rainforests are located. So here's a typical map that shows the different regions of Africa in terms of vegetation. Again, Sahara in the north, which is desert. You've got the sort of grasslands, and that's that light green area. And then you then see in the central part, the core here is this dark green area, which is actually where the rainforest is located. Now, you should know this term. This is the term desertification, and that means the transformation of arable or habitable land to desert. Now, as by a change in climate or destructive land use. So desertification can take place if the climate were to change, but if it's not a natural occurrence and it's actually because of human activity, then you can also get desertification. Now, this map shows us the areas where true deserts are, located in that reddish area, and the areas that are acute risk of desertification are those sort of dark yellow, and then the moderate to great risk areas are those brown areas. Now, how does desertification occur? Usually because of overgrazing or overfarming. That's the major cause for it. So people go into these regions where the grasslands are, and they overgraze them with their animals, they overfarm their land, they use up the water resources, and as a result, the land becomes dry and it's no longer productive. Here's a classic example. Here's a bunch of goats who have basically eaten away all the grassland in this area. Now, that might not so be bad, but the idea here is that if you're doing this and you've got 50 goats and your neighbor's doing it and he's a quarter mile away and he's got 50 goats, and another neighbor on the other side's got 50 goats and he's doing the same thing, well, that starts to add up. And as you can see in the background, there's still some grass, but eventually these goats may eat their way all the way to the forest line, and then you'll have to cut down the forest. But the land they leave behind is devastated. There's no more growth, there's no more grassland. The wind will come along and blow that topsoil away, and nothing will grow there again. And that's essentially how desertification takes place. All right, so here's a map that actually shows which regions of Africa where overgrazing are taking place. And you can see it's in the sort of green belt in the south, across the center, on either sides of the Sahara Desert, and on the eastern part of Africa. So deforestation is also a contributing factor to this. And as this picture shows, you can see that people are going into regions and cutting down their trees. And every time they cut down these trees, you then get erosion, which washes the topsoil away, which means nothing grows, no new trees. You can no longer use it for farming. And so as a result, deforestation also contributes to desertification. Here's a classic example. In this case, you've got a small farm, maybe one farmer. He goes in, he basically does what we call slash and burn agriculture. He cuts down the trees, he burns everything down, and for maybe 1 or 2 seasons, he's going to get a pretty good crop. But after the second season, nothing will grow. What made that land fertile in the first place was the trees, was the forest. Once the forest is gone, it won't be productive again for more than 1 or 2 planting cycles. And so what this guy will do is in a year or two, he'll move to the next batch of trees and do exactly the same thing. He'll cut down the trees, he'll plant for a couple of years, and then he'll move along. Now again, with one person, that's not a big deal. But if you're doing it, your neighbor's doing it, his neighbor's doing it, the other 50 guys in the village are doing it, you can see how this very quickly can lead to deforestation of the entire region, and then it can hurt their economy, it can destroy their land, and desertification can take off pretty easily. This map is also pretty good. This actually shows you which areas are susceptible So in terms of deforestation, you can see the brown, the darker brown areas are areas where it's drier, and then in other areas you see there's some deforestation occurring, but most of it's occurring in that central core of Africa, which is actually where the rainforests are located. Now this map here actually illustrates the changes in the climate. And of course the picture above shows desertification. But on the bottom on the left you can see that in the 1880s, the area which is located as blue was where they used to get rain. And the Sahel and the sort of area of the rainforest got a lot more rain. But by the 1980s, you can see how the climate map has changed. And it's simply just not raining anymore. In some cases, the monsoons aren't coming. It could be the result of people cutting down the trees, which create their own sort of ecosystem. And once you cut down the trees, there's no way to hold in the moisture. The moisture then doesn't get evaporated into the atmosphere to produce rain clouds, and everything sort of just dries up. Now, I don't have maps from the 90s or today, but you can imagine over the last 20 years that things have probably gotten worse. So here's our first map that shows basically where desertification is taking place. If I can compare that with the area where overgrazing is taking place, and then the next map, which actually shows me where deforestation is taking place, and this last map, which actually shows me where population is, where people actually live, and you can see the areas in each of the map that are being affected by certain kinds of behaviors and climate changes are all interrelated. Overgrazing is occurring right where people live. People happen to live right where the Sahel and right where desertification and deforestation are taking place, so the edges of the rainforest, and we can see that the desert's getting bigger each year. So again, one way to understand the geography of Africa would be look at different types of maps that show different types of behavior. Again, desertification, deforestation, we've got also overgrazing, and we've got human population as well. Okay, so let's end off here with a satellite image of Africa. And today that may be how we see Africa, but who's to say that your children or your grandchildren might see Africa look a lot different. We might see that green area get smaller, and we might see that desert area at the top get bigger and bigger with each passing decade. So it's something to think about.